Lo mandang gombo chen chen jambe yang chan za lo gang di lo zhen zhen ye zhen da nian da nam da rab sa re jin ye deng gen ji ye zhen zhe nian ye dong ga le ban zhe gan dai zi ben zhen ra ma re men doi dong an ye zhe re Donzo kan lai ben che dra se yan lai zhen che yang den so zhou da che zhou nian mo nian lo len jie jiang zhou zhou zi jing ma ri men sen dong ai niang ge jian nian jian zhe ra zhe de ne da jian sa jie dra se yuan den len zoi jia se tu wei gu Chu zhai chu dai chu ni gen zhe da le men se jiang bei yang lan di ma ra ba zhen ma ra ba zhen Amaram banzai na inde zende ge ge ro so ge dal de mo men ba ra san ka dai den je yong lo do bai lun zhe bon be na wai zai do so ang ze da ren de ba hai jong se che wa ran de na ya Gombo jam yang jin ni ne ge me bar ya tong wa rai shu en za indra ze ga rai ji re zen ben mai jam ba ni shu zon zre nam nyan den den ja za so en gan de la ma nam lo so wa in de Wen jian sang jian yin bin tun jian zhen zhen jian zhong dui jiam cui gong lui nam drai sam ye yin din den zhen gen chong jiru ling bi xiao so wa yin den jiam ba lai jian lai bin me nam ban zhen jia la se la jie yang zi ju song Kabai den den ben mai dong a lin jiang yang jian zi wang so wai den gan dre long jian bei rui nam ba zhen zhen qian nam nge xing de lam se jie ren men den jian yuan den jiang zhen de long zhen tai ye xiao la so wai den Women Jenji Yenji Bojan Nende Zoin Zanje Gunje Ngowen Ransen Chengun Ngun Zoin Denze Bain Zove Lame Shablo Zovande Kaya Wuku Yiro
거기 맨날 매주 당연히 또 있었어.
다만남 가다님 베심제 다음제 남제 산제 살라고 버차베 체도라 네 다기타레 라메투투 파르체긴슨지 온동아든테 야보체네 녜네 테네 텐냠솔랑 오르키오 냠베 콜론 찬주 셈 살타 데셈버 슈스
I request all of you to listen to the teachings with the following motivation, that in order to establish all sentient beings who have been my mothers on the level of awakening, I will listen well to this teaching and then put it into practice. I was teaching on the preliminary practices of called the seed of supreme enlightenment, the preliminary practices to accomplishing the Guru's wisdom, mind, dispeller of all obstacles. So the general explanation of the preliminary practices has 5 topics. The first is the explanation of the phrase preliminary practice, the meaning of the words, how the preliminary practices are important, the practices of the extensive, medium, and concise preliminary practices, and how the preliminary practices purify obscurations and gather the accumulations. And the 5th and final topic is the different types of preliminary practices, and now we're on that last 5th topic. So among the 3 types of preliminary practices, which are the preliminary practices of the material items, the preliminaries to the meditation session, and the preliminaries to the main part, we finished the first 2, and now we're on the 3rd type, the preliminaries to the main part. So for the preliminaries to the main part, we have the common preliminaries and the uncommon preliminaries. And sometimes we may talk about the special preliminaries also. But for now, we're just using the 2 categories of the common preliminaries and the uncommon preliminaries. And the common preliminaries are made up of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind from samsara. So before going over the 4 thoughts that turn the mind from samsara, first we have to go over renunciation. So the renunciation is actually a result, and it's the result of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind from samsara, which are the cause. So renunciation is caused by the 4 thoughts that turn the mind from samsara. So before we get into the cause of the 4 thoughts that turn the mind from samsara, we have to know what is the result that we're trying to get, the renunciation. So last time I went into a little more depth about renunciation. So here we're going into a little more depth and a more extensive explanation of renunciation as we did last time. So we'll continue now. So when we are learning about renunciation, first of all, we have to understand how important renunciation is. So why is renunciation so important? First of all, renunciation is the cause of attaining liberation. It's important for that reason. It is the necessary cause for attaining liberation. And secondly, it is a condition or a secondary kind of cause for attaining happiness.
tene dunga thamjile thar gu yore tene digi thamje thop gu yore tende gu yona tene ngejung la tenge gu yore.
So this is why renunciation is important, and this is why we need renunciation. It's the cause of liberation and it's the condition for happiness. So this is why we need it, why it's so important for us, because we need to be free from suffering, liberated from suffering to attain liberation. And we need the happiness. So this is why we need it.
텐다인데 예중 타르베 교인 바당 예중 디기토베 테니 겐인 바당 테니 예중 대 텐다 임바 인디 테니 나랑솔라 예중도 기구여레스 예중 나랑솔라 구구여바 대 가르치고레스는 예중나 땐데 테니 냠린 상부디 체투베레스 냠린 상부디 체바데 가르레스나 아니 디기토베기 규드레스.
So this is why we need renunciation. We need to be liberated from suffering, and renunciation is the cause of liberation. So we need that, and we need happiness, and the renunciation is also the condition that brings about happiness. And so then, how does this work further? Well, it is through renunciation, through the condition of renunciation, that we will be able to practice the Dharma well, and our practice will be kind of a true and good practice. It'll be the perfect way to practice. And so in this way, renunciation is a condition for attaining happiness through that practice.
예중 아랑라 그게 봐 점생이 땡기도 하디나라 점생 갈침보 낭라 테니 예중 타르베 교당 테니 예중 디기토바데 아니 갈침보 낭라 주로 그래 테니 예중 그게 봐대 아니 갈수고래 디기토베기 규 냠len 상보디 디나라 주그래 테니 아니 찍라 찍된래 찍라 찍고고요래.
So there's two reasons why, two things about renunciation. In the first place, renunciation is important. And secondly, we need renunciation for ourselves. So the fact that renunciation is the cause for liberation and the fact that it's the condition for happiness, these are the explanation of why renunciation is important. The first of the two, that renunciation is important because it's the cause for liberation and it's the condition for attaining happiness. And then the second aspect of renunciation, that we need it for ourselves. This is explained by the fact that when we practice renunciation, when we have a real renunciation, we will be able to practice really well. Our practice will be go really in the proper way, the right way, really well. So this is the explanation for why renunciation, why we need renunciation for ourselves, for our practice. And these are based on one another. The Nibati Tamala thing. So they're actually kind of mutually dependent. They depend on one another. That renunciation is important and that we need renunciation. Those two aspects of renunciation, each one kind of helps the other, supported by the other.
아니 굉장히 네 가르쳐보라디 예중 냠낸 상보대 테네 디기 톱직이 교로와 대낭신지 테네 예중대 아니 예중 톱체암 예중 깨지기 교대 텐로도 남바시 자루.
So in this way, renunciation is the cause for attaining a true happiness. And so then what in turn is the cause for renunciation? What do we need to bring about renunciation? That is the four thoughts that turn the mind from samsara.
Tene 다 예중 기능라 예중 가침 보임바 예중 디기토베 겐임바 tene 텐데기 예중 등아랑라 그거에 봐 숨데 tene 당보 예중 가침 보임바 나라 추주 그래.
So then the fact that renunciation is important, and the fact that renunciation is the cause of happiness, of true happiness, and these two. Oh yeah, the fact that renunciation is important, and the aspect of renunciation that is the cause of happiness, and then thirdly the fact that we need renunciation for ourselves. This also all goes into explain why renunciation is important.
당 예중 코랑 칸데레스 된 가르상 예슈임바 예중 코랑 테니 가르서를 예셈바데 셰바 하 셈라 송와 테니 땡켈 왔으기도 가르스나 테니 코라 동알기랑 시임바 셰바 코라 동알기 요라임바 셰바 테니 코라 동알기 두고리임바 셰바 셰양 테니 페나 코라 동알데 페나 메이 없다 보임바 셰바 심볼링드 보임바 셰바 아니 독들기 상담부임바 셰바 테네 캅게 쩨모 라 네미드바 동알임바 셰바 진 동알임바 셰바라 니에스라 비르라라 라바라바 다 딘데기 동알이요나 텔레타데기 삼바 칠라 템밤 삼바로디 술 중화되라 테네 예중라 비르에스라 가정이 공도 쉬르와.
So I explained last time about the kind of basic meaning of renunciation based on the two syllables of the Tibetan word nge chung. So ngeba, the first syllable nge, it refers to knowing something or and keeping something in mind and being decisive about something. And so what do we have to know and what do we have to keep in mind and what we have to be decisive about is that samsara is the nature of the suffering, that the basic nature of samsara is the suffering, and that samsara is like a great mass. All it is kind of a great mass of suffering, and it's like a factory of suffering, and that it's like a pit of fire. It's like being stuck in a pit of fire, or it's like an island of demonic monsters, or these rakshasas, demons, like an island of demons. And it's like a den of poisonous snakes. And the samsara is like the point of a pin. Its nature is just, it's like all of these things. It's just the nature of suffering. So when we fully know that and then keep that in mind and remember that and are totally decisive about that, then the second syllable is the chung. And then when after getting that decisive understanding of samsara, we will get the intention to be liberated from samsara, the motivation to be liberated from samsara. So it will come about or arise, which is what the syllable chung means, that intention or motivation to be free from that suffering of samsara.
다른데 다른 다 가르치고 있으나 아니 다 예정 거랑기 직들 작용도 되니 예생인데 동안에 바시에바당 중생인데 동안에 답대 연바지 이어바지라 땅 예정 세거래서 라바라바 다 된대기 예정데 아니 가리 규 가리라 때니 계고래서나 근데 규 동안라 때니 계기도 다진 안조 공도랑 예생인데 동안에 바시에바디 아니 규르도.
So today what I will talk about is a little further into it. So I've already explained that we have to come to understanding and certainty that samsara is of the nature of suffering. And then on the basis of that understanding, we have to give rise to the intention to free ourselves from that suffering. So now, where does this attitude of renunciation come from? What is the cause of the renunciation? The cause of renunciation is actually suffering. So first we understand that samsara is suffering, and in that way, it's actually through suffering that renunciation will come about.
상기 좀 된데 이제 가리송도 동알대 당부 시바시발라 테니 상기 템바시 진나라 테니 당부 동알기 템바오 세기도 동알기 템바오 동알 시바차 세니송도 동알기 템바오 세데 테니 최 템바 보경원이 샤 동알 호로와디 동알기랑 신레 라바레 게위신인지 권이 샤바 동알 시바차오 세나 로마 너단 템바기 테니 년내 아니 시고고요레서 로메게 총이 샤송
So the cause of renunciation is suffering, and what we have to do is to understand the suffering, to really fully understand and know what is about suffering. And this goes to the teaching of the four truths of the noble ones by taught by Buddha Shakyamuni, and he taught that there is this truth of suffering. On the one hand, he taught this, he gave this teaching that there is this truth of suffering, and then secondly, he said, then you have to understand the suffering. You should understand the suffering. So 그런 동료 계획신 잡으래.
그래, 동아리 계획신인 게 좋은 샤고래. 다 동아리 라벤지 계획신인지 고고 열어. 계획신인지면은 때 동아리 랍두고 말아. 근데 상기 좀 된데도 계획신인지 간절면은 때 동아리 신수라 그래. 랍두고 말아. 또 된지 고고. 동아리 템바오 슬랍두고 동아리 라바. 다 동아리 수시 고고 열어서는 간절 하모고 미디 시고고 열어. 냠바 보초는 샤로.
So there's these two, there's two aspects of the truth of suffering. First of all, there is the first aspect is that there's this truth of suffering. And then the second aspect is that you have to understand the truth. You have to understand suffering. So the first aspect, that there is this truth of the suffering, this is only can be understood, we can only understand that through a teacher. Without a teacher, we would not be able to understand the truth of suffering. So in that way, the first part of the first truth of the nobles is from the point of view of the teacher. The teacher has to explain the nature of suffering and that truth of suffering. And then the second aspect of the first truth of the nobles is that we have to understand the suffering, fully come to know that truth of suffering, and that is from the perspective of the student.
메시디 계획신인지 동아래 세땡 고고요래 계획신인지 동아래 세땡인데 먼저 동아리 뭐 시고고요래 근데지 동아리 뭐 시나 다더니 녜센데 레고요 녜센데 가는 셈라 녜바 로 수수게 하고 와 시바로 고고라.
So first, we don't know that a samsara is the nature of suffering. We don't understand the truth of suffering at first. Just as we are without being taught about it. But then when we are taught about the truth of suffering by a teacher, then we may come to understand what that is. What is the truth of suffering? And then after we come to understand that this is the knowledge and the kind of certainty that is referred to in the first part of the word, ngechung, or renunciation, which is nge, that sense of knowing and keeping in mind and being certain. This is what will come about after we are taught about the truth of suffering and then understand it.
Today, ngedi lebar sebala tungal sheko gudoa. Ta tungal dirangi she baina teni ngesen de legudo da. Ngejungi gyude ani tungal redoa. Tungal del tene teni ngesen de legudoa. Ta ngesen de lebyonde teni barso jungsing de legorata.
So in this way, it is through being taught about suffering that we come to this understanding and certainty about the truth of suffering. So in this way, we can see that suffering is actually the cause of renunciation, which is based on that understanding of the truth of suffering, right? Because we first were taught about suffering, and based on that teaching on suffering and that suffering itself, then we come to the certainty about it, which is part of renunciation. And then after that, we get to the second syllable, zhong, which is the arising, or it means arising or coming about.
Tene ta dungal tene ngejung kegiena tene dungal tene ngejung kesulde kandesen kegu yore sena tesong yore. Dungal mena kyoshe mena ngejung mena tharpa me tejir korbe dungal ten song.
So
dungal mena kyoshe me ngejung mena tharpa me te indi ta korbe dungal di ten song korbe dungal di shegu yore ten gu yore sa kom gu yore.
So so the suffering is the cause of renunciation in this way, and we needed to bring about renunciation. And there's a verse that describes this very well, which says that if you don't have a suffering, or you don't understand suffering, then you will not be weary with samsara. And if you're not weary with samsara, you won't give rise to renunciation. And if you don't give rise to renunciation, you cannot attain liberation. So therefore, you should contemplate suffering. So it means we have to really think about suffering and then meditate on suffering, contemplate.
Tene dungal mena kyoshime seti karisungu yoresana kamsum korwa dinangla tene dungal shik meba ina tene dungal pena nyawala chadangi dungal idala tegumgi dungal mila kega nachi dungal laminla tabji dungal hala chipobe dungal soba tende meba ina tene tende meba imba ina tene ngarangi gyula jikta kigirebe jikta kigi marwa dungal mena jikta kigi marwa dungal yuna ta jikta kigirwa dungal mena tene jikta kigi mare jikta magi na tene korwa nangla tene karsigore shenlogdan kyoshe tene kigi mare shenlogdan kyoshe magedi tene ngejung kigi mare ta tende ji ngejung de mena tene daji kongdo shiba nashin tarba tobeki gyudi yo mare tarba tobeki gyudi mena tarba togi mare tarba matoba ina tene nyondegi tegu rangelgi tegu sanjiji tegu la soba tobe yo mare.
Right, so the first part of the verse says that if there's no suffering, then you won't be weary with samsara. So in the samsara, there's all the various sufferings of the different realms, And if there wasn't this kind of suffering, we wouldn't be able to understand the nature of suffering and attain liberation. In hell, the beings in hell suffer from heat, extreme heat and cold, and the beings in the hungry ghost or the preta realm, they suffer from extreme hunger and thirst. And the beings in the animal realm, they suffer from fear of being eaten and so on. And in the human realm, they suffer from this pain of being born and aging and getting sick and dying. And in the demigod realm, they suffer from the suffering of strife and conflict, and the gods suffer from the suffering of having to fall and to die. When they die, they have to fall out of the state of being a god. And there's very many other kinds of suffering. So if there weren't these types of suffering that we can come to understand, then we would not we would not have a fear, and we wouldn't have fear of samsara. And if we don't have a fear of samsara, then we wouldn't be weary with samsara. And without weariness to samsara, we would not be able to have renunciation to be free from samsara. And without that renunciation of the intention to free ourselves from samsara, then we would not, with no way to attain the state of liberation, whatever level of liberation, like the Shravaka level of the Shravaka Arhat, or the level of liberation of Pratyeka Buddha, or the complete awakening of the Buddha. So all of this comes, the beginning is caused by suffering, and we need all of these causes.
코르베 동알 텐 송어래 김진 텔라 땐데 테네 코르베기 동알 텐데 시에버 제고고요래 코르베기 동알 텐서 곰겸네 ten고고요래 송.
So it's for this reason that we need to keep in mind and to think about the sufferings of samsara. This is very important to practice this, to remember, keep in mind the sufferings of samsara.
갈때 계란기 코로와데 테네냐와 사랑기 동알렘바 계란기 시 이다 때금고 임바 동알렘바 계란기 시 테네 미케가 나치지 동알렘바 계란기 시 라민 탑지기 동알렘바 계란시 아니 라치부동의 동알렘바 계란기 시에 바이나 테네 대당 냠도 계란기 뒤다도 곰갸 바이나 테네 계란 가릴리기레스나 계란라 직낭리기레 그러봐 동알베 딱 보이나 다 직낭리기로와 가서 공도 쉬임방하기 다 거와 동알기랑신 동알기 열랑 동알기 출코르 테네 심블링 두들기 창 갑기 제모다 보자 삼로야고 시당와이나 코로아 동알디 대당 찍바다 보지 요래 대랑 요대 요르다 응아랑 저게 이나야 동알라 동알이 마시디 테네 다 테네 코로나나 코르데 네 안에 동알 규만 집바 용화데 용구 여바데 좀전 디레 다 동알 규면 제바 윤체버 체발라 테네 코로 동알이 마 시고고 요래 테네 되진도 코로에 동알디 삼고고 요래.
So if we truly understand the sufferings of extreme heat and cold in hell, and the sufferings of extreme hunger and thirst among the pretas, the hungry ghosts, and the sufferings of fear and so on in the animal realm, and the sufferings of process of a birth and aging and old, and the sickness and the death in the human realm. And if we truly understand the suffering of conflict in the demigod realm, and the the suffering of having to fall from the state of a God realm. If we really meditate on that and fully understand it, then we will get this sense of fear because of that suffering, because of understanding about the suffering. We will really be afraid. And we will understand that samsara is just like, as I was explaining before, it has this nature of pure suffering. It is just a kind of mass of suffering. It's a factory of suffering. And it is in fact like a pit of fire, like being in a pit of fire or in a island of demons, or in the den of poisonous snakes. And on the being, it's also like the point of a pin. So so this is the understanding that we have to come to, and we have to meditate on the which is meditate on the suffering, and and so yeah, so this is only through if we don't it's only through understanding this nature of suffering and fully understanding the truth of suffering that we'll be able to liberate ourselves from it. It's through that intention of renunciation that comes about through understanding and suffering that we'll be able to gain liberation. Otherwise, as we are now, it's because we don't understand the nature of samsara, that it is the nature of suffering, as I've described in all those ways. And because we don't understand that, then we are wandering, we continue to wander around in samsara and go through this kind of existence. So in order to so this is why it's very important to first understand suffering, how samsara is nature of suffering.
Simbo lungbalake simbo sena tene chak thung ruba mur shasa chenge tende ki lungba jile keba yimba chasha tende ki lungba la ke ne simbo ki nganzo la shasa ruba mur chak thung sena nganzo kangel khajo yore.
Ruba mur is in the ruba
mur is in the ruba mur kiki ruba mur gira.
So I give you one of these analogies for you to keep in mind for this purpose, which is that a samsara is like an island of demons. So just imagine you're born on the island of demons, and you're living on this island of demons. You're surrounded by these demonic beings, these kind of monsters, and what they do is they eat your flesh. They eat your flesh, and they gnaw and they chew on your bones, and they drink your blood. So imagine what that would be like if you were living in this kind of situation where you had these beings all around you that were after your flesh, to eat your flesh and to drink your blood and gnaw and chew on your bones.
텐디지 강을 요나 니 강일 데레 타르도 이삼발 레기로와 말레 브랑레브로와.
And if you in this kind of situation, your body is in a constant danger, and going through this constant danger and constant suffering, living in this kind of situation. When you're living in this kind of situation where you're under this horrible suffering of fear and your body's pain in your body, then you have to be free of that situation, isn't it? You have to make sure you can get out of there.
대삼도 마세베 나란조 심볼링 라 끼바 잠기다 직망요래 따망요래 심보게 ngala 소잡용 심보게 ngala 착통용 심보게 니샤 사용 삼베게 따망요로 서로와.
So it's just from being born in that kind of island of demons. As soon as you are born there, there's that fear that these demons are going to drink my blood and eat my flesh and on my bones and so on. Immediately you will have this kind of fear.
근데 심볼링 라틴이 소잡 착통 루바무르체나 만절로 서로와 간대요. 동al 간대지요래. 대낭라 제네 드니 직낭다 땅낭 서로와 간대지요 거래. 대 서로와 될 때네 아니 셈발로 서로와 군농 간대지기기도 다르기도 기기도 와.
So just imagine what that would be like, what kind of fear you would have if you were living on this kind of island where there are these demonic kind of monsters, these beings who were always trying to eat your flesh and to drink your blood, to try to get your bones, to take your bones out and gnaw on your bones. Imagine that kind of fear that would come about through living in that kind of situation. Imagine the suffering of living there. And then immediately, because of that fear and the danger in the situation, you will want to be free of that.
다 배토는 샤바이나다 배신앙사고 정말 근데 예사래 이나양 원에 토라 텐데 인사마레 삼나 원에 토라양 대단다고 차셔래 그냥 나랑도 미다보질 차셔봐 이나양 통보 나랑도 끼용데 강에 가져요 끼비가서 끼비 동안.
So we can think about this kind of analogy of the island of the demons. I think, okay, well, that would be really scary and a lot of suffering to live on this island of demons. But is that really how it is? Is that really how samsara is or not? We can have this kind of doubt. And the answer to that is that it is actually like that. It is that kind of danger, that kind of suffering. For example, think about the suffering of being born. When we're born, there's really horrible suffering that we go through.
깨위 동아 된데 용배 값수 안소지 동아리 임바 셰디 텔레 동아들이 다르게 선발레 그래 레고 말해. 다가 낭신지 테니 나위 동아리 그러와. 나위 동아리티 테니 나와레 다르게 선발 깨리 깨 말해. 다가 낭신게 테니 개비 동아리 그러와. 개비 동아리티 다 계속 개월에 타르고도 선발게 동아리 그래 레고 말해. 다가 낭신게 치위 동아리 그러와. 치위 동아리티 아니 치위 동아리 다르게 깨리 깨 말해.
And when we experience that suffering of being born, there's no way that we will not want to be free of that suffering, that pain of being born. And likewise, when we get sick and severely ill, all of us, I'm sure, we all get the desire to be free of that illness. Isn't that true? That when you're seriously ill, you want that experience to stop, that suffering to stop. And then likewise, when we get the suffering of aging, and we get this, we have this desire, this intention to be free of that suffering of aging. Isn't it true? I don't think any of us would not have that intention to be free of that suffering. And likewise, when we have the suffering of dying, it's the same there also. We will all have the desire to be free of that suffering. Isn't that the case? So these are just the kind of basic sufferings of being human, of human existence. But there's really inconceivably many types of different other types of suffering in the human existence.
직능 땀만 게 용도 아니 텔레 심발로 그러다 심발로 마가와 작도 그래 간단한 저 감수 고라나라 현작도 와 제마 된대기 동알림바 시 직작게 소나 대 심발로 그래.
So we have to understand all of these types of suffering, the basic sufferings of being human, of human existence, and also the all the different other types of suffering that we go through as humans. And we have to really understand them fully. And once we understand them fully, we will have a kind of aversion and a fear for those experiences. And then on the basis of that aversion and fear, we will give up our attachment to samsara. We will become kind of disgusted or averse to samsara. And this is why, this is the reason why we are not, why we're still attached to our lives in samsara, and we have so much kind of clinging and attachment to our samsaric life, is that we don't understand suffering. We don't have this, so we don't have this fear and aversion for it. So we need to first meditate on suffering, fully understand suffering, and then get a sense of a fear of that suffering and aversion, and this will give rise to a real aversion for samsaric existence.
동알때 동알림바 시에서나 직작계기래 직작계바테 되니 제망은서 깜도시베 갈라 깜도기 교양 자도 가르선 콜라 직작딱부 시기온데 직작 동알이여바데 하고도 콜라 직작딱부 시대 아니 직작이데 되니 캡출거라 캡수적으로 캡수서서도 율식거고여 봐 보시기로 근데 저도 깜도기 교양 자도 직작.
And also when we fully understand the suffering, and then on the basis of that suffering, we have this kind of fear, and then that fear will also become a cause for our practice of refuge, because we are in this situation of danger and fear of the suffering of samsara, and being in that situation, we will then need to search for protection from that suffering, and we will have to find the object that will be able to protect us from this kind of suffering, and that will be the practice of refuge. So also this fear becomes a cause for the practice of refuge.
짬도시베 갈라 짬도기 주디 직테니 소르 직바당 대반니 단당랑 소디 녜조망라 테니 코로 동아리 바시바데 테니 직달리기도 대 짬도 주차도 그래
So when we get to the practice of refuge, the cause for refuge is fear and faith. It's the cause for refuge is fear and the faith, those two factors. So here already in the practice of renunciation, we've come to one of the causes for refuge, which is fear.
Ha jikbalipti tegijela shenloklebudo shenlokdi pena teenager 조선 짐바다고 생각해. 미 티바 나자 영엔 데잘라트네 칼락 샥지테나 티네 고쭈고쭈 칼라들 신발로 오 대자고 코로와디 통데 티니 쭈고쭈겐스라고 고고 열다.
So on the basis of understanding suffering, we get fear, and then through this fear of the suffering of samsara, we get this attitude of aversion to samsara. And the image that is given for the type of aversion that we should have is somebody who has a it's like a disease of the bile, the bile disease. It's like this kind of like a serious disease, also related to digestive system. Somebody just so somebody who's really sick like this, I think we can all understand the image, even though the disease is not doesn't translate to other languages, but we all know what it means. If we have this kind of serious disease, the bile disease related to the digestive system, we will the image is that we should be like somebody with a disease that is given a greasy food, a food with a lot of fat and grease and oil and so on. When this kind of person with this disease is given this kind of food, it makes them kind of disgusted and they won't want to throw up when even just thinking about eating that food. So, and this is how we should think about samsara. We should have the same kind of aversion to samsara that this ill person would have to the greasy food. Well, this is what is referred to by the the name for these practices, which is the four thoughts that turn the mind from samsara. This is what it means to turn the mind from samsara, is to have this kind of aversion. So when we get this kind of aversion, we will, at the same time, we will get weariness with the samsara. We will just be like sick of samsara, tired of it, weary with it. And it's on the basis of this weariness that we get renunciation. So renunciation is caused by these attitudes or these things, by these factors in our mind, these attitudes of fear and weariness and aversion to samsara. If we have a fear and weariness for samsara and aversion to samsara, then we will get renunciation. And where do those three come from? Where does the fear of the suffering samsara and the aversion and the weariness with samsara come from? They come from understanding the suffering of samsara. So the suffering is actually the cause of those three, and then the cause of renunciation. And this is why in the verse that describes the suffering, and then it describes that weariness comes from suffering, and then the renunciation comes from weariness, and then liberation will come from renunciation. Then it says, therefore, keep suffering in mind, contemplate suffering. So this is what that line in the verse all comes down to. So if we think about it this way, that verse is actually quite powerful.
근데 다시 공lang 얘기 아니 이중기 유조라고디 아니 코로나 동아리임바 시국으로 송아 좀 전제로 딱 코로나 동아리임바 시나 이중기 교디 되네 간데스는 이중을 봐 두고 요래 두서딩이 이슈서 딱 코로나 동아리임바 시디 되네 텔라 직다기래 직다기디 텔라 신호기래 신호기디 텔라 교시기래 교시기디 되는 예술기래.
So we were as explaining before, how you need to understand suffering. You have to know fully what about suffering, what is the truth of suffering, and this is the reason why it is so important to understand suffering, because there's this cause and effect that suffering, understanding suffering, will lead to weariness with samsara, and then weariness with samsara will lead to an aversion or disgust with samsara, and then that aversion and disgust with samsara will lead to renunciation. So this is why we have to understand suffering in this process.
교시 지금 숙천부 개발이나 직된지 공부 대되는 안에서 칸나게 치마도 대나신 카라 치마라 되는 안에서 시대 찍마라 또 돌기도 유기도 직된지 신자도 돌도 그래서 지능 샤그 말했어.
So when we talk about weariness with samsara, there's another image for that, is that we should, when we have this kind of weariness, we should have we should consider the things of this world to be just like our spit in our mouth. If we don't really care about our spit, it's not something very important, right? We will just spit it out, and it's, if we don't like it, it's not important for us. So in the same way, we should have this attitude. When people really have the attitude of weariness, they will look at the things of this world and consider them to be no more important than spit. They will not really, they won't consider them to be valuable or important at all.
다 코로나 동아리임바 시국이도와 다 코로나 동아리임바 시국이요나 코로나 동아리임바 시 미죽병인데 양 가르래도 딱도 잡고.
So we have to understand the suffering of samsara in this way, isn't it? So, and so what is it that allows us to understand the suffering of samsara? This we also have to think about. How can we understand samsara, suffering of samsara?
가르에서나 나랑도 동아리 망보 진영고에 이내 동아리 망보들라 동아리임바 시주고요 말. 대시 미죽은디 가르에서나 드는 나랑도 뒤줄라. 레로 시긴 남행 시긴 치쇼 시긴 그 직된 체계 시긴 고르에 전황라 신진 착바 시긴 된저요. 된저기 게임기 땅아도 다 동아리임바 시주고요 말.
So we experience all kinds of suffering in our lives, but we don't truly understand that suffering. We don't understand the reality of that suffering. And what prevents us from understanding the reality of that suffering is that we come under the sway of laziness and procrastination, and we come under the sway of our attachment to different things in our lives, and so on. And so it's due to all of these factors in our mind that we don't truly understand suffering, even though we experience it.
nganzola lelo yudi tine nganzo lelo ki ker nganzola namyeng yudi nganzo namyeng ki wang dutro tine nganzola chishul lega para jangaegi tinde ki komshi tinde ki chishul yudi tine tawaran go cha tine nganzo jikden choje shimba yore jikden choje la shingyo yore tinde la yudi tinde ji wang dushul tine nganzo jikden chunang la tine denzen ji lo shukde tinde ki tine chakwa yore. Tendeke chakwa yoba tsamgi tene ngazo dungal di xie dugu mare, tenzo xie dugu da. Tenzo ke tene dungal yinba xie dugu yo mare.
So in this way we come under this way of laziness, and we just get kind of caught up in that laziness and get it distracted. We get under the sway of distraction, and this prevents us from understanding suffering. And we have the habit to procrastinate and put things off for later. And this also prevents us from understanding suffering, from getting true understanding of suffering. And also we're so attached to the 8 worldly concerns. And it's through that attachment to the 8 worldly concerns also that we are not able to understand suffering. We can't see what's true in our own suffering. And we also have this delusion about reality. We cling to our experience as being real. And this also prevents us from understanding suffering. So all of these habits and the factors in our mind, they prevent us from understanding the reality of suffering. And then what happens is that we just understand those habits. That is our kind of reality of being attached and deluded and lazy and so on. And by being caught up in those habits and just knowing that way of being, that prevents us from understanding the reality of suffering. So the first of these factors is laziness. So this refers to that kind of feeling or situation, the state that we get into when whatever work we have to do, or whatever activity we're going to do, we get this kind of feeling we don't really feel like doing it, and we just feel a little bit bored and that lazy feeling. So this is what is referred to by laziness.
레레 차와 더면도 송어래 레로 여바이나 드니 차와 던다도 뚝뚝 말해 송어.
And there's another saying that says with laziness you will not be able to accomplish your aims. So it is, if we have this kind of a state of being of laziness, then whatever aim we have, whatever thing we want to accomplish, we will not be able to do it.
현대기 레로데 나랑 줄레지 tinengaranzo 코로아 동알 셰버 셰베기 쩐디디 지기 말 코로아 동알 임바기 쩐디디 마지 용데 티네 코로라 직다 지기 말에 대가 나시 다지 송바나치레 직다 마지나 시 신로 지기 말에 티네 교시 지기 말에 녜중 지기 말에 대사마 레로라 티네 연구도 와 쩐주 코로아 동알 쩐디 지기 말와 코로아 동알 임바 셰디기 쩐디 지기 말와
So then also when we have the laziness, we will not give rise to this diligence in our practice of wanting to know about the suffering of samsara.
코로 동알 남성 시기 말아 텔 쫀디 최고로 코로 다리데 동알 간데레 코로 동알 간데레 야기를 동알 간데레 시부고 여러 레레신도 텔레 시부도 쫀디 최고도 테 쫀디 수기디 가고요 레로기 가고라.
So it's also through laziness we won't get the diligence and the kind of energy to work on understanding suffering. As in order to understand suffering, we have to put some effort into it, some diligence into it. And so it's the laziness also that will block that diligence, prevent us from putting in the effort and diligence to that. And then when we are not able to put in the effort to understand suffering, we won't understand it, and then we won't get the fear of it, and the weariness and aversion and so on won't be able to give rise to renunciation.
세상 돌아 레로기 경침부 잡지고도 알아서다. 빼나 빼다고 코데부 전에 샤소나 빼나 알아서 쪽지지 소고고요나 미식이 쪽지지 소고고요나 테네 코 쪽지지 소엘라 냠네 데데바이나 테 쪽지 소도그레베 거기 소도그 말아 그 냠네 데데나 쪽지 가데 소고.
So in this way, the laziness really does us a lot of harm, or it really causes us great loss in our lives. It causes us great loss in our lives. For example, even somebody who wants to just make a table, if they have laziness and they just sit there not feeling like they want to do it, they won't even be able to make the table, isn't it?
대나신 원어도 쪽지소에기 싱디 키용 세르가디 키용 토아디 키용 되네 대가나시기 저지든지 키용에 샤샤 소야를 냠네 샤샤는 그 쪽지 자그레베 자그 말아와 소고로와 준비 제고로와.
So and then when this carpenter, for example, they bring the all the materials for the table, they bring the wood and the nails and the glue and all the different things they need to make the table. If they don't if they're lazy, if they have this quality of laziness, even though they have all the materials for it, it will just sit there. It will not it won't be able to become a table. They won't be able to make it into a table.
크로아텔라드니 동알 락바당 저 망고 시우지 요래 연나양 안저 크로아팅한테 셰도 제국도 셰도 마치 발레로 전에 대바이나 크로아 동알이 마 시기레베 시기 바로.
So there's all kinds of suffering in samsara. There's various really inconceivably many types of suffering, and we have to know about that the suffering in samsara. But if we are lazy in this practice and we don't make the effort to try to understand the suffering, then we will not be able to understand the truth of suffering really. So we need to put in energy to that effort.
이바데 남행 세미양니 당한저 코로게 쳐라 양니 되거라 맹니 속 토는데 되니 속을 양 되기래 속이야 보이나 가와지기래 속두자이나 시당지기래 속 야도 시담이나 때문기기래 내가 나신게 암조라야 딘디랑 지기래 나라야 내가 메시지 딘데 신 옹고 나기 주일라파 양니 텐소르고요.
And so the second factor here, which prevents us from understanding suffering, is a distraction. So this refers to just being constantly in the state of being distracted by what we see and what we're doing in our life. And so this is actually the way most of us spend our life, is being caught up in distraction, being caught up in these experiences of things that we see and things that we hear and so on. And when we see a beautiful object, then we will give rise to attachment in this kind of mode of distraction. And when we see ugly object, then we will give rise to aversion. And we see a kind of neutral object, then we will be in a state of ignorance. And the same with what we hear, we will give rise to attachment, ignorance, aversion in this mode of distraction into these sense objects. So this is the way that we generally spend our lives, is in the state of distraction into this objects of the senses.
Number the yang song yong de tini ngarang zu mi de zo ne ani shido yin de ani ngarang zu kora dongal shegi tuze de ragmen do namyengi.
Yeah, so we spend our life in the state of distraction to the objects of the five senses, and eventually our life is used up in this state, and we die, just being constantly distracted by the objects of the senses. And when that in that eventuality we're not able to understand the truth of suffering, or we didn't get a chance to understand the suffering of samsara because we just distracted and spent our whole life that way, and then died without coming to an understanding of suffering.
레공 될 추도 주발라 결국이요나 근데 결혼 되는 추도 고발라 드네 드네 파 남영제 수 남영제니 되네 스트레 대바이나 드네 팔라 잘라다 출라 드네 미타스네 대바이나 결혼 추도 주바데 존을 레공을 레득 말아.
So for example, if we have to go to work and get to our office at 10 o'clock, for example, and this is our in order to do what we have to do, in order to do our job at work, we have to get there at 10 o'clock. And then we may leave at 9 o'clock to get to work at 10 o'clock. But if, for example, we spend our time on the way to work getting lost in different distractions, seeing this type of nice thing, and then getting interested in that, and then hearing that, and getting attached to these type of things that we hear and see, and spend all our time in these kind of distractions, and then it ends up that we never actually get to work because we're just lost in this distraction. So this is what it's like.
And
this state of distraction, or this kind of a mode or factor of distraction in us, this really ruins our life in a way. It really ruins our life, because we are not able to understand the truth of suffering, the reality of suffering, due to this state of distraction.
make the sugla chao yong de pe sha bai na mix sugla chao ba de chema lips ndo ko de tine cheme thong de ko cheme de shae kang thong go ta ko shae kang re do sne cheme na la zu yong de ko shi du do de mix sugla cha pe chele ma me chi se ngarang zo mix chilo yeng de na te ngarang zo mi zo ne ani khoro dungal she gi tu ra ma.
So this is described in some texts, the way that distraction into the five objects of the senses will keep us from accomplishing what we need to accomplish. So the moth is distracted by the flame. It's drawn into the flame, right? So this is an example for our being distracted by what we see. The moth sees the flame and it thinks this flame is a kind of beautiful palace, a kind of nice place, a nice kind of palace to go to. And it gets kind of drawn into that, distracted by the flame, so to speak, and gets drawn into the flame and then is killed in that flame. So it's the same way with us, that we are distracted by what we see and constantly drawn into those objects of the sight of our eyes, and we are also ruined by that. That's the image for it. And so we can see in this way how distraction is just really causes us a great loss, isn't it? So in the same way, the deer is distracted and drawn into the sound of the flute. So it is said that if you play the flute around a deer, it will just sit there and listen. It will be completely drawn into the sound of the flute. And then a hunter will come around and be able to kill the deer, to shoot the deer with the arrow. Yeah. And then it is said that the bee is attached to this sense, and then it is killed by the flower, which it gets stuck in the flower, trapped by the flower. So the bees, they're really drawn to the scent of flowers. They're so attached to the scent of flower. They love the scent of the flower so much, so they will fly towards the flower, and then they can get caught in the flower and get stuck and then die. So this is something we can see that very clearly. So similarly, the fish is attached to the flavors, the sensation of the taste and flavors, and then they are caught in the fisherman's hook. So this is it is due to their attachment to flavor also that fish are ruined. They're killed by the fisherman, because the fisherman will take their hook and then put the kind of insect on the tip of the hook in order to attract the fish, throw it in the water, and the fish will, because of its attachment to that flavor of the insect, the bug that is put on the hook, it will go towards the hook, then get caught in the hook and be killed by the fisherman. So yeah, so in that way, the fish is killed because its tongue, so to speak, or its faculty of sense is attached to the flavor. And in the same way, because his body is attached to that nice kind of tactile sensation, the sensation of the touch on the body. The elephant is sinks into the mud and is also kind of ruined or killed by being having to sink into the mud. So it's said that these elephants, they like to sit in the mud. They like, the sensation of mud on their body. So they will sometimes go into the pool of mud, but they can get stuck there, and then sometimes even can die from that. And it's because of this attachment to those tactile sensations of touch that they're distracted by this sense objects, or they're killed. So we can see through these images, through these analogies, how a distraction into the 5 sense objects is really causes us a great loss. And it's because of those distractions into the sense objects, we're not able to understand the reality of suffering. So we have to understand in this way. We have to really understand well how laziness and distraction are a cause. The So we should understand really well how distraction, how laziness and distraction are great obstacles for us and cause us so much this kind of difficulty, and they don't allow us to understand the reality of suffering, the truth of suffering. Okay, so this is the end of the session for today. Now let's all recite the dedication together.
Sonam de damje sebani tobne nyeben ranam bamje ne jenga na ji balam joba suben zolen ro an ro sho